Good morning and welcome to Niaga AWANI, and today we're looking at one of the most important questions that's shaping the global economy, which is how do we build trust in artificial intelligence or AI. And as we see that AI accelerates across sectors, Malaysia is charting a clear path towards becoming an AI nation by 2030, and central to that journey is the role of standards, the bridge between innovation and also responsible governance. So to help us unpack this, we're joined by two experts at the heart of the global and also national AI governance ecosystem. From the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, Ms. Cindy Parokkil, the AI policy lead, and on her right is from Malaysia's own National AI Office, NAIO, Mr. Darmain Segaran, the policy manager. Thank you so much for being here, Cindy, and also Darmain. How are you?
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Amazing. All right, let's start the conversation at the global level before we localize it to Malaysia's path. Cindy, we see that the pace of AI deployment worldwide has accelerated dramatically, but the trust and also accountability remain central concerns. So from your global vantage point at ISO, why have international standards become such an essential or important foundation for AI ecosystem today?
Thank you for that question. And I think at the global level, since around 2018, the conversation very much has been around high-level principles. What are the key principles that demonstrate that AI is governed responsibly? So principles like transparency, safety, human oversight, inclusivity. So these are all principles that are being discussed and are critical for AI governance. But then the question becomes, how do you demonstrate that the AI system that you're deploying or designing is in line with these international high-level principles? And that is where standards come into play, because standards are that practical bridge between high-level principles and practical implementation, because standards are essentially methodologies, checklists, frameworks that help organizations demonstrate that they are taking the right steps when designing and deploying AI in line with the principles that they have outlined.
All right. Thank you, Cindy, for that answer. We've seen the why globally, but now we want to know on how at the global level as well. So many governments right now are debating AI regulations, also frameworks, and also the AI specific legislation. So with your experience at ISO, how do international standards complement and also support and also guide at the same time the national regulation efforts, especially by translating principles into implementable, also auditable practices of AI?
So governments have different tools available to help achieve policy objectives. This can be regulation, this can be legislation, procurement policies, etc. Good practice in terms of regulation is that regulation is not prescriptive, not overly prescriptive. It says what the outcome should be, but it doesn't explain how to get there. And that's where standards come into play, because standards can provide the methodology, the practical guidance in terms of how to achieve that objective. So I think the key difference that we need to keep in mind here is standards are voluntary tools. So regulation and legislation are mandatory tools. And the magic happens with the interplay between the two. Regulation and legislation are tools that governments have that they can use to achieve various policy objectives. But good practice in terms of regulation is that regulation is not overly prescriptive. So the question then becomes, how do we achieve these objectives that are described in the regulation or in the legislation? And that's where standards come into play, because standards essentially are checklists, their processes, their methodologies that can help demonstrate that a company is developing and deploying AI systems in line with good principles, good practice, etc. And I think the main point to keep in mind here is that standards by themselves are voluntary tools. However, regulators, if they believe that these standards are good and they are developed in a open, consistent, consensus-based manner, they can point to these standards as a way to demonstrate compliance to regulation. So for example, in the information security space, governments can indicate or make it a requirement that companies that wish to handle government contracts, which deal with sensitive data, they need to show that they comply with 27001, ISO IEC 27001. And this is a way that there is an interplay between voluntary standards and mandatory tools.
Thank you. I'll get back to you on the standards that you mentioned earlier. But Darmain, building on what Cindy shared about global momentum, we see that with the global frame that we want to bring on the scale of local or Malaysia's roadmap towards 2030. So how does the MYAI standards, am I pronouncing it correctly, or MyAI standards initiative can actually support that national vision towards 2030?
Thanks for the question. The vision of the AI nation was set out in the national plan last year by the Prime Minister. And I think all policies are going to be pointing in that common direction. So the National Action Plan, AI Action Plan that our office is working on and hopefully will be produced soon by the Ministry of Digital, this points towards, again, developing an AI nation. And a core theme of these policies and these drives is increased adoption. And increased adoption across industry, uptake by developers within the spectrum of the ecosystem. This requires a core fundamental of trust. And I think that's where you'll see the pillar being drawn out across these policies, the common thread that cuts across, which is trust in these systems. And if you want users to be comfortable in using AI systems, to be comfortable in this existing in the ecosystem, trust again is a core element. And that's where this initiative has come about. As Cindy explained earlier, it's the link between these two elements, between regulation and turning it into something that's operable on the ground. And that's where standards play a role. So the My AI Standards initiative is focused on bringing awareness to standards and their potential use in many different ways, not necessarily just for compliance, but also for policy building, framework building within organizations, and even by policymakers themselves.
And in Malaysia, that trust, that translation shows up in the sequence of policymakers have chosen, and to which Malaysia has taken a deliberate step-by-step approach, which is principles first, and then standards, followed by regulation, also legislation. So what's the strategic logic for sequencing governance this way in a fast-moving technology space, especially in AI?
So I think the sequenced approach is one way of looking at it, but with the speed of how AI is being deployed, what you'll tend to see, it's also a sort of a parallel approach, almost a layered approach. Now, I think Cindy mentioned earlier that principles have been the global trend, and we saw that since 2018 till about now, where principles sit at the core of most frameworks around the world. And the need for translation of those principles is where standards come in. Now, moving beyond that is where in certain high-risk deployment sectors, certain use cases that pose that excessive risk, you'll see more regulation and legislation that might need to tie this together, the governance frameworks together. Now, all this is happening at common pace, actually. So in Malaysia, the minister announced the development of the AI governance bill. That's being developed, but in the meantime, the ecosystem needs to be ready. Because in a situation where legislation is deployed and the whole ecosystem, the industry is not ready for this large shift, you'll see a failure of that operation of that legislation. And so what this initiative is aimed to do is actually begin that process of getting comfortable with understanding these principles, how they work in practice, and working out the kinks before regulation really kicks in to refine.
Makes sense. Now we want to get specific about the tools organizations can actually adopt, which you already mentioned earlier, Cindy. Two anchors keep being referenced, which is the ISO 42001, the AI management systems, and also the ISO 23894, the AI risk management. So how do these two standards actually help organizations operationalize responsible AI on the ground, just beyond policy statements?
So I think standards at the end of the day are very practical tools that companies can use when they think about deploying AI in their organization or designing AI in that for a matter of fact. So it provides this framework to them to show and demonstrate that they are developing AI in a responsible manner. So if you take ISO IEC 42001, it poses very pertinent questions that organizations should think about when they put AI into an organization. For example, do you understand the context in which AI is being deployed? Because the AI system will interact with, the organizational context and the larger context. Has that been thought about? Is there leadership commitment? What are the controls that are being put in place? Are you coming up with a policy? So it gives you that kind of framework. And the beauty of standards is that it can be used by organizations of any size in any sector. So it's this versatile, agile tool that it provides a starting point to organizations when they are deploying AI in a responsible manner. There's another standard that has come out, ISO IEC 42005 on impact assessment. So this basically helps an organization in thinking about and showing and demonstrating an impact assessment of AI. So rather than coming up with your own, way of demonstrating that you have done an impact assessment, look if there is an international good practice that is out there that you can use and follow to demonstrate that you are taking the right considerations on board.
So basically talking about standards, so much to be considered, so much to be thought, and it's not written in silos. They're actually forged by coalitions from contributions across governments, industry players, and also researchers, and many more. So why is that multi-stakeholder approach essential for AI, especially for something as complex and also fast-moving AI governance, and how does it actually strengthen both adoption and also accountability at the same time?
Thank you for that question. So the first point I'd like to say is standards are a product of multi-stakeholder collaboration, be it for AI or for any other topic area. When we develop standards from an ISO perspective, from an ISO IEC perspective on this matter, we make sure that all voices are heard. It is very important because standards are a product of consensus, and it is very important when we develop good practice that we have all the different stakeholders that are impacted by the topic matter are around the table. So this is industry, government, academia, civil society, researchers. So we really try to bring all these experts together to develop international good practice, because it's important to hear all their voices. In an area like AI or in technology, the issue at our disposal is not just a technical one. It is a socio-technical one, meaning that people are being impacted. So it is really important to have these people around the table who are being impacted by AI. And that's why multi-stakeholder collaboration is a key principle that we follow in standards development.
And that brings to my next question to Darmain. When Malaysian companies look for practical help, where do they start? Because Darmain, for example, when Malaysian organizations like SMEs, for example, visit the My AI Standards platform for the first time, what practical support or clarity do they gain? And how does it help them navigate the often overwhelming landscape of AI standards and also frameworks I just mentioned earlier?
Yes, I think overwhelming might be the right word to use. The My AI Standards initiative has an overall overarching aim, which is to increase awareness and use of standards by various segments of stakeholders. So that's policymakers, industry, academia even. And to achieve that, one of the starting points is the portal that is set to be launched. This portal, the immediate focus is navigating these many standards that exist. And it starts with the ISO standards that exist, which is a number in about 80 standards in total. Now, when I say navigating, what I refer to is not all standards apply to every single sector industry. So members of certain segments of or sectors will be able to filter through to find relevant sectors for their own use. Now, that would be a starting point. Now, moving from there will be increased levels of awareness programs around this. There will be use cases that might be deployed, and the portal is set to go in that manner. But the broader initiative is to increase the ability to use these standards. Internal policies, for example, if an organization wants to build internal policies, don't start from zero. Refer to the standards and see what frameworks are available there and build from there. So when you do that, you find yourself being in alignment not just with local best practices, but international and global best practices, which automatically makes you interoperable. So if you're reaching out to wider markets and those standards are in play there, then you're already interoperable.
And let's translate that approach or standards into outcomes for Malaysia's key sectors. Where are you seeing the earliest, maybe most tangible benefits of standards aligned AI in Malaysia, whether in safety, interoperability, auditability, or time to deployment across healthcare, across sectors like manufacturing, also smart cities? Maybe are there any examples that you want to share or patterns that you can actually share?
Okay, so I think the sectors that you mentioned earlier are those critical immediate sectors that will have immediate reference points in the portal when it's launched. But there will also be a segment of cross-cutting standards, so it cuts across all sectors. All of these point towards an intention for industry to become digitally resilient. And what that means is, in the deployment of AI systems, where there is a risk of failure of these AI systems that may have high impact to certain stakeholders or to users, this is where the standards will aim to actually make those organizations resilient and be able to continue to operate or to have fallback measures, right, within, so that the impact is mitigated and that operations can continue. So that is one of the key aspects for these identifying of these critical sectors. Now, while these might be the first few to be filtered through on the portal, there is an intention to expand this to other sectors and build and continue to build this portal in terms of content and availability, as well as the manner of navigating these different standards.
And this is for Cindy. Let's relate back to Malaysia, where we see that countries like Malaysia are rapidly developing their AI ecosystems. So how can actually participation in international standards help emerging digital economies accelerate responsible AI adoption?
And I think this goes back to the point that Darmain made earlier about trust, right? In simple terms, you trust things that you've had a hand in making. So by participating in international standardization, you're essentially co-creating this international deliverable. So I'll just say a few words in terms of how ISO operates, right? So we at ISO, we're essentially a network of 175 national standards bodies, one member per country. In Malaysia, that member is called JSM.
Okay.
So JSM has a very important role to play in Malaysia in that they convene all the stakeholders that I mentioned earlier, government, academia, industry, etc., to collect input and provide that input back to the international system based on what the needs of the country is. So that process is very important in creating these standards. So by participating in standards, you're essentially co-creating these standards, meaning that it will be easier to adopt them because they're also reflecting the needs of Malaysia. So that's why participating in international standardization and having your voice heard is very important to increase the uptake of these standards and thereby deploy AI responsibly in your economy.
And that plays directly into Malaysia's partnerships with ISO. So Malaysia, we know that the through programs such as the AI Policy Capacity Building Journey, and also we have global dialogues between ISO and also NIO. So how important are these international partnerships for Malaysia's AI development moving forward?
I think it's absolutely critical to continue these dialogues, and the important question there is the spaces in which these dialogues occur. They vary. So depending on whether it's a global dialogue between countries, but also, as you mentioned, the capacity building programs, which are much more workshop style intensive programs, like the one that ISO ran, which can result in impressive outputs such as this. And we see the important spaces here that I spoke about is spaces for interaction and learning between our country and other countries as well, and not just on the success points, but also the failure points. Okay. And in the room, when you're having these open discussions, is where we learn, and we also understand how we can further collaborate. And I understand that this capacity building program is going to continue through due to its successes, and Malaysia is keenly going to be involved in that moving forward.
And before we wrap up, maybe we want to give on the first step towards the companies, how can actually act on AI deployment towards the organization. So maybe we can start with Cindy first. For organizations that are just starting the AI journey, what is the single most important first step that they can actually take to align with trusted AI standards? Because for some companies, they can find the ecosystem confusing. So what can you suggest to them?
So rather than reinventing the wheel based on the objectives of the company, I would suggest as a first step, visit the My AI Standards portal to see what standards are out there and try to map out which of those standards can help you as the organization achieve the objectives that you have laid out.
How about you, Darmain? Final word to Malaysian business watching right now. They are experimenting right now with AI, but not yet thinking about governance. So what's your practical message to them as they scale their AI adoption?
Industry is definitely growing on the idea of governance that's necessary for AI. And those that are not thinking about it, I think it's the message is to begin thinking about it, and maybe in the context of standards as a starting point. And the reason is because the risk that is being posed by AI sometimes spills beyond your own organization. So you have to think a bit wider than your own organization, your own industry. Impact-wise, it can be significant. So yes, echoing what Cindy has said, starting potentially with visiting the portal and understanding, and then building on that to governance frameworks within your organization, aligning with the national strategy.
All right, thank you so much to Cindy and Darmain again for both of your insights. So what's clear right now is AI leadership isn't just about developing the advanced technologies, but it's about building trust. And Malaysia is positioning itself to innovate responsibly and confidently on the global stage. So thank you so much for watching, and you can find this whole discussion on all of our social media platforms, and that includes astrooni.com. See you next time.